Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we take a closer look at the week's top political stories. Ballotpedia connects people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. We're here to give you the facts so you can form your own opinion. I'm Victoria Rose, and thanks for being with us. Now that the dust has started to settle, we're recapping the midterms with none other than the Doug Kreneisel. Welcome to the show, Doug.
Hi, Victoria.
I had to say the because he's a very hot commodity these days with the journalists. And I'm very grateful he made some time for us.
Oh, yeah. Anytime.
And it's been a few weeks, so we're happy to have you back. So we're recording this episode on Tuesday, a week after the midterms, and we're still waiting on election results for a handful of races. But we've got plenty of outcomes to unpack, so we're going to jump right into it. As of Tuesday afternoon, Democrats have secured 50 Senate seats to the Republicans' 49, with Georgia heading to a runoff on December 6th. And the U.S. House is still up for control, with Republicans leading with 214 seats to Democrats' 204 seats, with 17 races still yet to be called. Doug, have we seen any midterm election outcomes similar to this, where the party in power loses the majority in the House but retains control in the Senate? Granted, that's counting on Republicans gaining control of the House.
Yeah, exactly. There are actually two very recent examples in 2018 and 2010. Heading into 2018, Republicans controlled both chambers. They actually increased their majority in the Senate, but lost control of the House. And in 2010, Democrats controlled both chambers. They lost seats in the Senate, but maintained control while Republicans flipped the House.
Okay, so this is something that's actually been somewhat common over the past decade?
Definitely, but it's pretty much contained to the past decade or so. Before 2010, the last time we saw a party lose the House but maintain the Senate was in 1930. Republicans controlled both chambers. They lost the House but maintained a razor-thin control of the Senate with a 48-48 tie. This is before we had senators from Alaska and Hawaii. And there was a Republican vice president who served as the tiebreaker. But 1930, 2010, and 2018 are the only three examples since voters began electing senators directly in 1914. Also, all three of these examples happened during a president's first midterm, like where we are now. You had Herbert Hoover in 1930, Barack Obama in 2010, and Donald Trump in 2018.
That's some pretty helpful context. While it might not be too unheard of now, in the grand scheme of things, it is pretty rare. But let's pivot back to 2022. Just when we thought election season was over, Georgia once again said not yet. So Georgia's headed to its third runoff in 2 years. Incumbent Senator Raphael Warnock, a Democrat, and Herschel Walker, the Republican nominee, are set to face off in a December 6th runoff election because neither candidate received more than 50% of the vote. What happened in Georgia, and what's next for the two candidates over these next few weeks?
Well, Warnock finished with 49.4% of the vote, receiving roughly 35,000 more votes than Walker, who still managed to nab 48.5% of the electorate. There was a third-party candidate on the ballot. That's kind of where those extra votes went. So neither of the candidates made it over that 50% threshold they were looking for. And like you mentioned, a similar situation occurred in 2021 when Georgia held two runoff elections for the U.S. Senate. Both of the Democrats won. Those victories gave Democrats control of the U.S. Senate. But as far as what's in store for the next few weeks, I mean, if you live in Georgia, your Thanksgiving is probably going to be full of political ads. Sorry to tell you right now, but that's probably the lay of the land. All eyes will be heading in that direction over the next couple of weeks.
Poor Georgians. Do any other states require runoffs for general elections for federal offices?
Sort of. Georgia's the only one where they hold a primary earlier in the year, pick their candidates, and then could have a runoff after November. Louisiana is kind of similar, with a big caveat being that the elections in November technically are the primaries there. So in Louisiana, every candidate runs on the same ballot. So you can have multiple Democrats and Republicans, everything running. If somebody gets over 50% of the vote, they win outright. Otherwise, the top two finishers advance to what might seem like a general election runoff. But again, in Louisiana, it's technically the general election itself that they would advance to. And then you have states like Alaska and Maine, which use ranked choice voting, where voters rank their picks on the ballot, and then those ballots are counted and recounted, dropping the lowest vote getter each round until somebody has over 50%. So ranked choice elections are functionally similar to runoffs, except that voters make all of their decisions at the general election rather than having to come back and cast a new ballot later, like what we're going to be seeing in Georgia.
And I don't know if you feel this way, but I feel like waiting for some of these results to come in is like watching paint dry. Is there a deadline where we can expect to know the outcomes of every race, whether they're decided or headed to a runoff, or is that more of a state-by-state thing?
Yeah, it's definitely a state-by-state thing. And even with the guidelines in place, I always feel like there's some way that like our expectations can be shot through a little bit. But once a state has certified elections, no more challenges can be heard to the election's outcome. So that's kind of a hard stopping point in most of these instances. Delaware was the first state to certify its results last week on the 10th. 26 more states and DC have certification dates later in November. And then 18 states have certification deadlines in December, ending with California, whose deadline is December 16th. And then 5 states don't even have a specific certification deadline written into law.
So turning to the U.S. House, we have 17 races remaining uncalled. All 435 U.S. House districts were up for election, and Democrats held a 220-212 majority with 3 vacancies at the time of the election. Republicans needed to gain a net of 5 districts to win a majority. So what are some noteworthy House races that have been recently called?
Yeah, you really could take your pick. There are plenty out there, and they all kind of tell different stories, which is one of the fun things with House elections happening all over the country. Hillary Scholten defeated John Gibbs in the race for Michigan's 3rd congressional district. And Gibbs actually defeated the incumbent Peter Meijer in the Republican primary earlier this year. And Meijer was one of the 10 Republicans in the House who voted to impeach Trump in 2021. So Gibbs defeated Meijer, but then Scholten defeated Gibbs. That district was already kind of a battleground-ish district before redistricting, and then actually after redistricting, it became a little bit more Democratic leaning. One of the biggest upsets, so to speak, was in Washington's 3rd district. Like in Michigan, you had a Republican incumbent, Jamie Herrera Butler, who voted in favor of Trump's impeachment. She similarly lost in the primary to Joe Kent, but it was actually Democrat Marie Perez who came out on top in the general election. And several outlets rated this race as lean or likely Republican heading into the election. And then in Iowa, you had Zach Nunn, a Republican, who defeated incumbent Cindy Axne, the Democrat, in the 3rd district. And I just realized that all of our examples so far are in 3rd congressional districts. So maybe that's a coincidence, but maybe not. But Nunn's victory there gives Republicans control of all of the state's congressional districts for the first time since the mid-90s.
3rd districts are competitive, I see. Now at the governor level, 35 of the 36 elections have been called. I'd love to hear some of the governor races that stuck out to you. Let's talk about the undecided races first. That's in Alaska, but unless there's a seismic change, Republican Mike Dunleavy will be the victor. He's currently up by 30 points. So over in Arizona, there was the race between Republican Kari Lake and Democrat Katie Hobbs for the governorship. As a reminder, the seat is up for grabs because Governor Doug Ducey was not able to run for re-election due to term limits. That race was called on November 14th. What happened there, Doug?
Yeah, Katie Hobbs, the incumbent Secretary of State in Arizona, pulled out the victory with 50.4% of the vote to roughly 20,000 more votes than Kari Lake, who still managed to get 49.6% of the vote, which is really, really close, but larger than the 0.5 percentage point margin that would trigger a recount in Arizona. This is the first time Democrats have won a governor's race in Arizona since 2006. We also now know that Republicans will continue to control both chambers of the legislature. So Arizona, which had a Republican trifecta heading into the election, will become a divided government moving forward with a Democratic governor and a Republican legislature.
And what other gubernatorial races stuck out to you?
In Nevada, incumbent Democratic Governor Steve Sisolak lost. He's probably going to be the only incumbent governor to lose re-election this cycle. Republican Joe Lombardo will take office and, sort of flip of Arizona, will be working with a Democratic-controlled legislature there. So another divided government in Nevada. And Democrats also won control of the governorships in Maryland and Massachusetts. Those races weren't particularly toss-ups by any means as far as like heading into the election, but they will kind of shift the balance of power in those 2 states where Democrats control the legislature. So their wins created 2 new Democratic trifectas in those states where we previously had a divided government.
And even in states where that control of the governorship didn't change, we saw some pretty interesting outcomes. Do you have any examples of this?
In Florida, Republican Governor Ron DeSantis had a great night, winning with almost 60% of the vote, which is a very big change from his first election in 2018, where he won by less than half a percentage point. So big change in the margin in Florida. And in Wisconsin, Democratic Governor Tony Evers won re-election, while at the same time, voters split their tickets and re-elected Republican Ron Johnson to the U.S. Senate.
And you just gave me a great segue into our next topic, because 26 states held elections for governor and U.S. Senate, and 5 so far have elected a U.S. senator and governor from different parties, which is always really interesting to us.
Yeah, that's right. In addition to Wisconsin, you have Kansas, where voters reelected Democratic Governor Laura Kelly and incumbent Republican U.S. Senator Jerry Moran. In New Hampshire, you had incumbent Republican Governor Chris Sununu reelected, along with U.S. Senator Maggie Hassan, Democrat. In Vermont, Republican Governor Phil Scott reelected. Democrat Peter Welch was elected to the open seat there, left by retiring incumbent Patrick Leahy. And then in Nevada, again, you had Joe Lombardo, the Republican, elected, and U.S. Senator Catherine Cortez Masto, the Democrat, won election for the Democrats, which actually was the race that gave Democrats 50 seats in the Senate.
Yeah, I find these outcomes so interesting. We also recently published an initial split ticket analysis in November 14th edition of the Daily Brew, which our readers can sign up for by clicking the link in our show notes. And that analysis shows the share of the vote that the winning U.S. Senate and gubernatorial candidates won in each of the states that voted for both offices. Doug, what did it tell us?
Yeah, the 5 states with the largest ticket split gap were Kansas, Ohio, Oregon, Oklahoma, and Hawaii. Those gaps range from 8 to around 11 percentage points. And then the states with the smallest ticket split gap were Nevada, Idaho, Alabama, Wisconsin, and Maryland, where they range from 0.1 to 1.1 percentage points.
Let's shift our focus to state politics, which I know you are personally excited about. How many state legislative chambers were Republicans and Democrats defending respectively? And did any flip?
Yes, love me some state legislatures. Heading into the election, Democrats controlled 36 chambers. That's, House chambers, Senate chambers, things like that. Republicans controlled 62, and the Alaska House was controlled by a multi-partisan power sharing agreement. As a result of the election, Democrats have so far gained control of 3 chambers. They flipped both chambers in Michigan, creating a Democratic trifecta there for the first time since 1983. They also won control of the Minnesota Senate, which also creates a trifecta there. That brings the party's current total to 39 chambers. And then all 3 of those chambers previously controlled by Republicans. So Republicans have lost 3 chambers so far, bringing their total to 58.
And then there are 3 chambers that are uncalled, right?
Yeah, exactly. So this is the so far aspect of things. In Pennsylvania, the House is coming down to 2 uncalled districts. Republicans currently hold a majority, but Democrats have made gains so far. Again. And then you have both chambers in Alaska, which is using ranked choice voting. So it might be a while until we know the final results there.
Yeah, we might even have to wait for the new year for Alaska. They always keep us on our toes.
Correct. Republicans currently hold numerical majorities in both chambers, but that's only half the story. Like you mentioned, the House right now is governed by a multi-partisan coalition made up of Democrats, independents, and Republicans. Based on what I've read so far, it's looking like at the outset, control of both chambers will be pretty slim, which gives more moderate members of both parties greater leeway to buy into and create these sorts of governing coalitions. So even if Republicans or Democrats win a majority of seats up for election in either of the chambers, it probably won't be until sometime later this year or even into next year when we know how everybody teams up to control these chambers.
And once all the races are finalized, what are we going to do with all those vote totals and outcomes? Are you excited to work on any specific analysis?
With state legislatures? Do you even have to ask? Yes, we have a bunch of really cool analyses that we are waiting to roll out. One of the first will be a look at defeated incumbents, which, as things stand right now, has been pretty low. There are definitely a lot of uncalled races, so the number is subject to change. We will also look at total changes in party control and make some historical comparisons there. One analysis we like to do is tied to presidential midterms. So typically the president's party loses seats in the first midterm. So once the dust settles on the state legislative results, we will be able to see whether A, that was true in 2022, and if so, B, to what extent.
Yeah, I love the cyclical nature of our work. We get to dive into these races, or for me, these policies enacted via ballot measure, get the outcomes, analyze them, see how they fit into broader historical trends, and then we get to move on to the next election cycle and do it all over again.
Yeah, we haven't even talked about ballot measures yet. Are there any top 15? Yeah.
That was my sly way of throwing it in there.
Oh, hey, it worked.
Yeah, we called the last outstanding top 15 measure this morning. That was Oregon Measure 114, which was approved with 51% of the vote. The measure enacts several firearm regulations, including requiring permits issued by local law enforcement to buy a firearm and prohibiting ammunition magazines capable of holding more than 10 rounds. And then I'll just give you a quick recap of some interesting top 15 measure outcomes. So we talked about this last week, but voters in California rejected the two ballot initiatives, Propositions 26 and 27, that were related to in-person and mobile sports betting. Proposition 26 was rejected by 70% of voters, and that proposition was backed by American Indian casinos. And then 84% of voters rejected Proposition 27, which was backed by companies like FanDuel and DraftKings. Those campaigns surrounding those two ballot measures raised over $462 million, likely more. The latest campaign numbers haven't been finalized, making them the most expensive ballot measures in the state's history. So that's a pretty big expensive loss for those campaigns. Voters in Nebraska approved Initiative 433, which will incrementally increase the state's minimum wage to $15 by 2026. The margin was 59 to 41% there. And since 2002, voters have decided on 21 measures to increase state minimum wage, approving all of them. So minimum wage at the ballot box is pretty successful. And then over in Alabama, voters approved a new constitution by 76% to 24%. The major changes introduced in the rewrite included arranging the Constitution into proper articles and parts and sections, removing racist language, and deletion of duplicative and repealed provisions. Alabama's former Constitution, adopted in 1901, was amended 977 times and was the longest written constitution in the world. So excited for Alabama's new Constitution.
Yeah. I had no idea. It's like longer even than like anywhere, any constitution, anywhere of any government. That's crazy.
Yeah. Yep. That's what we found.
Man, imagine being a law student in Alabama. It sounds like not a lot of fun information to know.
There's certainly probably some incentive to make it more concise. So, well, that's all I have for you this week. Thank you for coming on, Doug, and unpacking our midterm results. We look forward to having you back later in the year to go over your analysis.
Yeah, most definitely. Looking forward to it.
Hey everyone, this is Jeff Paulet. Looking for an internship? Ballotpedia is seeking self-starting and civically minded undergraduate and graduate students to join the Encyclopedia of American Politics. Our internships with the editorial, communications, external relations, and tech teams give you an immersive and hands-on learning experience. Ballotpedia's internships are part-time, completely remote, and the application for spring internships opens soon. To learn more and apply, search internship at ballotpedia.org or via the link in our show notes.
Are you feeling down? Like you're just hoping anybody will come along to lift your spirits up with, I don't know, some trivia? Well, what a coincidence. I have that with Footnote Facts with me, Paul Rader. Today's episode is on the impact of state legislative term limits. And as we dive in, ponder today's trivia question. Overall, from 2010 to 2022, what state has had the most term-limited legislators? Listen for some hints before I answer the question. So first, it makes most sense to talk about where we see state legislative term limits. We see them in 15 states, and they can be consecutive limits where a legislator serves that maximum length of time, but then they can come back to that chamber after a term or so away. Or it can be cumulative limits where the legislator serves that length of time and that's it. Get out of the chamber and don't come back. How long those limits are differs from state to state, but most commonly you see 8-year consecutive limits. And generally speaking, it's been more Republicans than Democrats that have been term limited. So with the 2022 election just held by the time you're listening to this, let's talk about that first. Oh, splendid idea. Overall, most of the term-limited legislators hail from Maine, Michigan, Missouri, and Montana, a bunch of the M states. 86 of 368 state Senate seats up for election had a term-limited incumbent, or 23.4%. 47 of those were Republican and 28 of those were Democrat. And similarly, if you go by each state, 8 of them had more Republican term-limited senators, while 5 states had more Democrats that were term-limited. But on the House side, this gap was even larger. Naturally, there were more representatives that were term limited compared to senators. 166 out of 1,261 seats were up for election. 108 Republicans compared to 58 Democrats in state houses were term limited this year. Now, as I just mentioned in the trivia question, we have stats on term limit impacts from 2010 to 2022. So, how many legislators were affected over this whole time frame? For state senates, remember that in some states they are staggered terms, so that only half of the chamber is up for election in a given year. And from 2010 to 2022, we saw 604 state senators term limited out of 2,397 total seats that were up for election, equal to 25.2%, and most of those were Republicans, 315 of them, in fact, compared to 229 Democrats, and then 16 nonpartisan senators from Nebraska. At least they're nominally nonpartisan. Michigan and Montana had the highest number of senators affected in this time frame at 69, and Michigan's rate of term-limited senators out of the total Senate seats up for election was highest at 45.4%. A lot of them in Michigan. Nevada, on the other hand, only had 14 term-limited senators, but remember that legislative chambers vastly differ in size from state to state, and Nevada has one of the smallest senates in the country, which inevitably impacts term-limited counts. And with state houses, we see some similarities in the data to the state senates. Once again, Nevada ranks the lowest, with only 20 state house seats out of 294 up for election that were term-limited. And in Michigan, we had the highest rate of affected representatives, though Missouri just eked out the highest number of term-limited reps. Again, keep in mind that state houses are naturally bigger and thus tend to see more term-limited members than their respective state senates do. So with all that in mind, we now return to today's trivia question, the answer to which has been said several times already. Overall, from 2010 to 2022, what state has had the most term-limited legislators? It's Michigan. Great Lakes State wins the Legislative Term Limits Bowl with a grand total of 270 term-limited legislators for that time period, ahead of second place Missouri at 253. Award yourself however many points you want, but to finish this episode off by taking a knee is our quarterback, Victoria Rose.
Thanks, Paul. That's all for this week's episode of On the Ballot. Thanks again to Doug and Paul for coming on the show with me today. Make sure you don't miss an episode by subscribing wherever you listen to your podcasts. We're going to be taking next week off for Thanksgiving, but we'll be back the following week with another new episode. Until then, if you have any questions, comments, or love for Ballotpedia, feel free to send it to us at ontheballot@ballotpedia.org or on Twitter @Ballotpedia. I'm Victoria Rose, and thanks for listening.